and thank you, State Councillor, for the welcome. I understand that I'm in the presence of world champions of innovation, so I shall be very careful what I say. I was talking to Joanna a moment ago, and she was describing the audience as a spectrum between grown-up adult people who know what they are doing and crazy people. So that's the perfect spectrum for me. Thank you very much for listening to me in English this morning. I'll try and leave 5 minutes at the end of my comments for your questions, but I'll be here pretty much all of the day, so if you want to beat me up in private afterwards, please do so. I'm going to very just quickly run through some thoughts around where I think we are at the moment and where I think we may be headed in what comes next. And the title that I was asked to address was around business innovation and sustainable development. But I'm going to set it in the context of long wave economic cycles, because I think we're at a moment in long wave cycles where suddenly things that seemed impossible for quite a long time become possible. And Danielle's mentioned Volans. We set up the company in 2008. It's a certified B corporation. It's trying to push from incremental approaches and mindsets towards systemic change, as she mentioned. We've done books, we work with clients, and so on. Up on the top right-hand corner there, you see a cartoon, and I'm sorry it's very fuzzy, because it's a photograph of a photograph of a photograph. But 20 years ago, I got a Financial Times cartoonist, Ingram Pinn, to do me a cartoon of a board meeting of the future, where the fish represented the natural world, the woman represented the base of the pyramid world, although we didn't use that term then, or bottom of the pyramid, and the robot was there as a symbol of the deep future. So it was actually even longer ago than 20 years, because it was before the triple bottom line. Just bear that robot in mind. I'll be coming back to him or her in a moment. So these are the questions I'm going to address. What's Wave 6? Where are we currently? What does breakthrough innovation really mean in practice? And how is the global C-suite, by which we mean the top teams of the 1,000 most influential companies in the world, regardless of size, how are they thinking about all of this increasingly? So firstly, a little bit about Wave 6. Now, in talking about Wave 6, I'm quite aware that Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum is talking about the fourth industrial revolution with a really brilliant short book. If you haven't yet read it, I recommend it very highly. So he's using that language. Steve Case, who founded AOL, is talking about the third internet revolution. There are many different characterizations of where we are. But this was the forum earlier on this year talking about polling executives in different parts of the world on what they saw as likely to happen by 2025. And some of it's to do with wearing computers. Some of it's to do with, not surprisingly, 3D printing this, that, or the other. But I was really struck by that last one, the first artificial intelligence member of a board by 2025. So suddenly our robot doesn't look quite so much of a joke as it was 20 years ago. And maybe that will be a big improvement in the way that boards work. We'll see. But at least the artificial intelligence will be connected to the world in a very different way. And I will say very little about this cartoon, but it's the same cartoonist that 20 years ago I asked to do this particular image. But this came out after the Davos Forum earlier on this year. So Wave 6. There are different ways of thinking about how our economies evolve. Some people think that they go in a straight line upwards. Some people think that they go in waves. People characterize those waves quite differently. But the way that I think about them is that we're coming out of a fifth wave since the Industrial Revolution. These wave structures tend to be about 40 years long. And when you change from one wave to the next, things get very uncertain You don't need to look far around the world at this particular moment in time to see a huge amount of uncertainty. And you see it in the elections that are going on at the moment in different countries. Overarching all of those waves is a paradigm. And people nowadays talk about paradigms very loosely. You know, a change in the formulation of a toothpaste is a paradigm shift in dental hygiene for some people. That's not how I think of paradigms. I think of paradigms as something that when they change, it's really nauseating for the people locked into the old paradigm. It's existentially challenging. And I think that's very likely where we're going to be. And the reason why the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, is up there is the entire sustainability agenda, of which I've been one part, has evolved within Wave 5. And Wave 5 has had a very particular set of priorities and concerns. I think Wave 6, which is going to be quite different, built around a very different set of technologies, including robotics, synthetic biology, big data, artificial intelligence, these sorts of things, is going to challenge the sustainability movement to really raise its game quite profoundly. But I think we're within 4 or 5 years of that sixth wave structure being very much clearer to everyone, including the sustainability movement. On the left-hand side there, you have a series of slides just plotting our progress as a species since 1950. I was born in 1949, so this is pretty much the story of the world since I arrived on this planet. And it's amazing what's been achieved. Exponential growth in everything from GDP to fertilizer consumption to you name it. But you won't be surprised to see that the shadow side of that is you also see the exponentials in a whole series of different areas of growing concern. And that includes carbon content of the atmosphere, methane, ocean acidification, deforestation, those sorts of issues. So that's the context, and I think we're all now very aware of all of that. I love this image. This is going out a number of decades into this century, and it's trying to plot what the world will increasingly feel like. And this is a graphic representation of the shift of the center of economic gravity in the world and of demographics towards Asia. And I think it's titled the Anthropocene. We're moving into a very different scientific era, geological era, the first time in the Earth's history where one species has an impact akin to geological forces. I won't go into what we're seeing every day of the week in the media at the moment. In some cases, I'm sure some activists might be feeling, we told you so, this is coming. But we are living in a very different reality. And the problem is that our political systems are very much attuned to an old order, not the new one. And we see, as I've just a moment ago referenced, a series of elections which are throwing up the most strikingly horrible, I don't want to get too political here, but I mean, who would have thought that Donald Trump would be in there with a spitting chance of becoming President of the United States of America? I would not have placed my bets pretty highly on that. I don't know what the 23rd of June election referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union will throw up. But the closer we get to that, the more the Brexit or the exit option strengthens. Now, again, I wouldn't have predicted that a few short months ago. There is something going on in the wider world where ordinary people are becoming increasingly agitated about globalization and its impacts and the failures of our political establishments. Having said all of which, to the central image here, I'm actually very much an optimist. And I'm an optimist because I think our species tends to do its best work when it's forced into a corner, where it has no choice but to try and do the right thing. So a few quick thoughts on breakthrough innovation. About 18 months ago, I was involved in producing a book called The Breakthrough Challenge with Jochen Zeitz, who was at the time chairman and CEO of Puma, and his colleague in founding the B team, Richard Branson, The image at the top is Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic space plane. You will all know that one of those crashed a little while ago. The point I would make is that we're moving into a period where we're going to have to try all sorts of things that we do not know how to do, and the rate of failure will go off the scale. And the question is whether, as human beings and as societies, we can cope with that rate of failure, which is absolutely essential if we're going to experiment in a really serious way. I won't read the different elements that were emphasized in the book, but one of the fundamental points is that in the old era, business talked about leveling the playing field downwards. And what we're increasingly hearing CEOs and other business leaders talking about is leveling the playing field upwards to meet these new realities and requirements of business. Now, I won't go into the detail of this diagram, simply to say, when we think about what we're trying to do here, and I love the work that the Impact Hub network do around the world, and their scaling, their growth over the years has been quite extraordinary. What we have here is two axes. And on the horizontal axis, you have one around impact. When I started work, I did environmental impact studies in places like Egypt. That was looking at the negative downside impact of industry and trying to reduce it. What we now have, and the Impact Hub movement is part of all of that, is a process where people are much more interested in positive impact and how you create it, how you value that, how you get rewarded for producing that. The reason why I've got those two images there, thank you very much indeed, that's great. You can hear my dry mouth even better than I can. Thank you. So the cartoony pictures either side are two sets of brothers. Some of you will recognize on the right, Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google. On the left is somebody I had breakfast with in Silicon Valley about 4 weeks ago, Carl Page, who is Larry Page's brother. And what's extraordinary about those two brothers is when you talk to Larry Page about Google X or Sulfur X or these sorts of things, what they're talking about is a world where entrepreneurs are increasingly trying to benefit 1 billion people. A fairly ambitious target, but that's what they're talking about. At the other end of the spectrum, Carl Page of the Anthropocene Institute in San Francisco is talking about problems that will impact negatively 1 billion people. So that could be pandemics, it could be climate change or whatever. So that's your horizontal axis. The vertical one is the spooky one. The vertical one is about scale. And most people talk about scale, factor 1, factor 3, factor 5, whatever. This goes factor 1, factor 10, factor 100. And what we're increasingly seeing entrepreneurs talking about is how do you play into that exponential space. And beyond that horizontal horizon, things go seriously weird. So we're moving from a world of business as usual, and even, I'm afraid, change as usual. And I put much corporate social responsibility work into that space, even shared value work, into this exponential space. But exponentials can take us in different directions. They can take us to breakdown outcomes around catastrophic climate change, or they can take us to breakthrough. And you see this amazing frenzy of activity in California again at the moment with the so-called unicorns. And you have magazines like Fortune celebrating this new breed of companies going to $1 billion of turnover in very short. The second Fortune cover there is people now beginning to talk about and what happens when all of these people want to list and realize that value in very short order. There's a stampede, and we may well see that bubble deflate quite sharply. Nonetheless, some of these businesses will come through as people like Google and Amazon did. And I think some of them will be immensely exciting. If you take an area like mobility, and last night, Roma Ruska, who I thank for bringing me in from the airport in a mobility car, there are these more and more examples of sustainable transport and mobility options in the world. And Zurich and Switzerland obviously doing particularly well in that context. But I was with Bosch in Germany, Stuttgart, a couple of months back, and I put up the image of these two bubble cars. The first one was in the early 1950s. That bubble car was pretty much the state of the art of the German automobile industry at that stage. And think of what that's become subsequently. The one on the right hand is obviously the Google autonomous car. So again, we have a tiny little object which actually potentially is the seed of a quite different future. I think we are in very exciting times. And I'm not going to talk this one through. It's just anyone who's focused on the exponential innovation world of people like the X Prize or Singularity University will have seen this diagram many times. But the point is that the economy and technology and business models are starting to behave in ways that our brains are singularly poor at dealing with. And I think many of you as entrepreneurs and innovators will know that very well. And again, if anyone hasn't read Exponential Organizations by Salim Ismail and others, very highly recommended. I mentioned the X Prize. Some of the things that they're doing are, you know, if you look at them with a grown-up's mindset, they look weird. They look things. So, sorry, X Prize is a foundation based in Los Angeles. It's founded by a number of people, but particularly Peter Diamandis, who's written books like Abundance and Bold. And the X Prize basically gives awards for people who do extraordinary things. So, for example, the first one was the Ansari Space Prize. So that was $10 million for the first private group that got a spaceship twice in the space of 2 weeks, almost into orbit. And that became the nucleus of the Virgin Galactic space offering. The biggest X Prize at the moment is the Google X Prize. And if any of you can get a robot onto the surface of the moon, have it move around independently, send back meaningful data, photographs, whatever, you stand to win $30 million. So those are the X Prizes. And basically what they're trying to do is stimulate amazingly ambitious innovation. So I find what they're doing immensely exciting. I visited them about 4 weeks ago also. And one of the prizes they have at the moment is for carbon capture, for a prize for the first people who bring back carbon from the atmosphere into useful products. Now again, that may sound a little bit strange, but one of the companies that we're working with, Covestro, which used to be Biomaterial Sciences, just IPOing out of Bayer, already are working with Antwerp University on carbon capture into polymers. So this is increasingly happening. A few final comments around how the top teams of companies are dealing with all of this. It varies, as you might expect. Some industries are being absolutely pummeled by the forces that are now breaking loose. If you look at the European and particularly German power utilities sector, in the space of about 4 or 5 years, something like 500 billion euros of value just disappeared because of the nuclear shutdown, because of the growth of solar energy, RWE, E.ON, Enel, these sorts of companies struggling to find their feet in the new order. But some really good work happening in that space. Same time, you've got some really interesting changes. Harvard Business Review, most of you probably read semi-religiously, or not. But they do these rankings, and we heard about rankings just a moment ago from the State Chancellor. The rankings they do are of CEOs, and they've just changed the rules. So now there are 20% of the value of the rankings go to people who are dealing with social, environmental, ethical, governance considerations. And for the first time ever, somebody came to the top of the rankings last year, Lars Rubin Sorensen, who's CEO of Novo Nordisk. Nobody had ever heard of, which is why they did this cover. I didn't put the sticker on the cover. It was printed that way. A picture of him there. What was really interesting is that he was there because of the triple bottom line. He was there because he covered the social, the environmental, the ethical, the governance, these sorts of components. Somebody who helped him do that, Lisa Kingo, now runs the Global Compact, United Nations Global Compact, a grouping of 8,300 companies. I just put the B Corporation thing just to say, isn't it extraordinary there too? There are now something like 1,700 companies around the world as certified B Corporations, And very big companies like Danone and Unilever are now asking the question, how do we become B corporations as well? Some of them, Unilever in particular, has one subsidiary, Ben & Jerry's, that is already there, but wants to grow that out. So towards a conclusion, sustainable development goals are out there. I don't know what you think about them. They make my head dizzy. I can think of 3 things. 17 stretches my imagination a little bit, but really, really useful framing. And in the middle there, boards and C-suites are now thinking about, well, what do we do with all of this? And last year we did a very short report. It was meant to be a short report. It was called the Stretch Agenda, and it was about a board meeting in which the different C-suite roles debated the Sustainable Development Agenda as they saw it. Partway through the process of producing this short report, one of my colleagues, she and I have worked together for 11 years, said, why are we doing just another short report? We pump them out, no one reads them. So why don't we do a play? And I thought, oh, God. Why don't we do a dramatization? So that's what we did. It was a dramatized board meeting. And right at the end, 2 people who'd been invited into the boardroom as observers erupt, suddenly start to talk about their future. And they're millennials. They're members of the same company, but their perspective is quite different. This is my final slide, just to say, some of you will have been following the solar impulse around the world. Covestro, I've mentioned them a moment ago, are one of the sponsors for that. At the bottom, you have 3 logos which flag 3 different projects that we're currently working on. The first one is with the Global Compact. We're looking at technologies and business models of the future. We're also doing a retrospective review of the sustainable development movement over the last 30 years for a big conference in 2017. In the middle, you have the Business and Sustainable Development Commission, which has got people like WBCSD, World Economic Forum, B-Team, Global Compact, and so on involved. And there again, we're really focusing on business innovation, and particularly in the business model world. And the third one is the Global Reporting Initiative. They have a new technology consortium looking at the implications of emerging technology for transparency, disclosure, reporting, and so on. And that's, big data and artificial intelligence, a bunch of other things, and I chair that. I won't read out the quote, but for me that sums up exactly what the spirit of this agenda ought to be. Thank you very much indeed.
This very inspiring presentation. We do have time for questions, and please do not hesitate if you're not feeling like speaking English. You can also speak German. We'll manage to translate. I saw one question. Yes. Microphone's coming.
Thank you very much, John, for joining us. Could you elaborate a bit how you see our topic, sustainable development, in the business world of the growing parts of the continents?
Yeah.
Obviously, continents don't shape change, of course. China, Brazil, Indonesia, India. What could you tell us about the development of how these issues are perceived as a business issue?
The simple answer is it's not simple, in the sense that I work in places like India, Indonesia, China. I'm in the Ivory Coast in a couple of weeks and so on, and it's immensely various. So quite often the real innovation that you can see in these sorts of geographies or regions or countries is being done by multinational corporations because it's part of a broader impetus or strategy. But out of sight, and people like the Impact Hub would have a much closer perspective on all of this, you see this ferment of new activity breaking loose. The Schwab Foundation, the Skoll Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Omidyar Network, all of these sorts of people are funding some of these activities, and some of them not getting funding from those sorts of people at all. So I think there's a danger, and one of the things that we're wrestling with the Business and Sustainable Development Commission report, which will launch in Davos in early next year, is trying to make sure that we get a proper representation of those invisible initiatives and experiments and businesses and value networks and so on. So if there are people in this room that are working into the emerging economies, into the less developed countries and so on, and have good practical examples. And these examples do not have to be successes. One of the case studies we're thinking about putting into our report to the Commission is the Nano. I've worked with Tata in India. The Nano was a brilliant attempt to try and do a sort of an Indian bubble car, people's car. Really not terribly successful, and yet a brave attempt. So what can we learn from that? So I think it's mixed, and the one thing that I think we have to call out is that innovation and entrepreneurship in any country in the world is critically dependent on the business environment within which it is born and evolves. And so issues like bribery and corruption and broader transparency are fundamentally important. So that will be part of the message as well. But if you have other examples that we'd benefit from hearing, I'd love to know more.
Möchte jemand diesen Faden noch aufgreifen? Wir haben eine Frage dort in der zweithintersten Reihe, bitte. Vielleicht können Sie kurz sagen, wer Sie sind und dann die Frage stellen.
Hello, my name is Eva van der Wand from the Foundation My Climate, and I would like to know if you believe in the bottom-up approach of exponentials, especially in big corporations, because you mentioned so many brave faces and people, but mostly out of the management or higher positions. So, what about the big corporations and the small people who want to change something in the daily life as well?
I believe in grassroots innovation. I believe in bottom-up dynamics in the end, and particularly when you have one of these old waves giving way to a new wave, the people who will drive the most transformative change tend to be people on the edges of the current system. And they often are outside big companies, or they're young and lower down companies. The reason why I'm putting some of the bigger names in there, people who are actually, by today's criteria, successful, is because when they speak out about the need for change, that provides air cover for some of the younger or more innovative people, both in their organizations and outside, to do new things. And part of what we've done over the years is to bridge initially between mainstream business and NGOs, because NGOs were a lead indicator of where the future might take us. And then increasingly within recent years, bridge between mainstream business and social entrepreneurs, because social enterprise is a way of innovating in very difficult circumstances, and you get disciplines like frugal innovation and lean startups and that sort of space.
Do you have an example where a grassroots movement actually is still visible in a concrete result?
Well, I mean, if I just stick with the social entrepreneurship space, then the most conspicuous example would be Mohammed Yunus and the Grameen Bank, and their solar business and so on. It started off absolutely the grassroots, with him putting his hand in the back pocket. But I think the problem we have now is that as a species, we like to be able to see heroes or heroines or very particular individuals and understand their story. But at the moment, there is this huge, great mass of bottom-up innovation beginning to happen. And the question is, how do we better support that work and over time bring that increasingly into the mainstream? And if the mainstream doesn't want it, how do we blow up the mainstream without wanting to sound like a complete screaming revolutionary?
Do we have one more very urgent question, very short question?
If not, I'm here in the rest of the day.
Okay, so thank you very much,
Thank
John.
you all very much indeed.
Thanks for staying with us.
Thanks, Daniel.